Colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second day of this online event, Designing with Nature in Town and City, which has been developed in collaboration with the Landscape Institute. And we warmly welcome both AOU and LI members, friends and colleagues to this second day of the event. We'd also like to thank our event supporters, the Glasgow Urban Lab at the Glasgow School of Art and the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Yesterday, we focused on the legacy and prospect of design with nature and set the scene around Ian McHarg. And we hope you agree that the session fittingly celebrated McHarg's authorship of Design with Nature, as well as his position as founding chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. We also hope that you found the presentations on how Glasgow and the west of Scotland got to where they are today, and our trip to the Netherlands and the city of Utrecht is both stimulating. I'm now delighted to hand over the chairing of today's session to the President of the Landscape Institute, Jane Finlay. Jane.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. But before we start, I'd like to spend just a few minutes setting the scene. So I'll just share my screen with you. Hopefully you can see that. If somebody could give me a thumbs up, that would be great. Excellent, thank you. So 2020 marks the centenary of Ian McHarg, landscape architect, ecologist, urbanist, and native of Glasgow Clydebank. And this time of this year, we'd have also seen the convening of COP26 in Glasgow. And in the light of our current crisis, it's fitting to hold this event around Ian McHarg, someone who advocated an ecology of urbanism over 50 years ago, and whose ideas are as pertinent today as they've ever been. So today's session, we're looking at designing with nature now and in the future, and includes some project examples at a variety of scales from the United States. These demonstrate how the principles of design with nature, along with cross-discipline collaboration, can contribute to successful outcomes for ecological urbanism. 50 years ago, when McHarg implored us to design with nature, it was offered as an alternative, and now it's become imperative. The link to nature is so important for life on this planet. We're all part of a global ecosystem where plants, animals, and other organisms, as well as weather and landscape, work together to form a bubble of life. However, at times like this, we automatically revert to contact with nature as it's an innate human need. And this affinity is associated with our evolutionary dependence on nature to provide essential resources for our survival. And there's now a wealth of research that demonstrates the positive impact nature has on people's physical health, how they feel and how they behave. And it provides us the designers, with the evidence we need to justify why we need quality green spaces. And it's interesting at this time to look back, because throughout history, diseases have shaped our cities as epidemics lead to significant change in planning and development of important infrastructure. This slide is the first purpose-built public park in the world. It's in Birkenhead, which is my hometown, or as we from Birkenhead like to call it, Birkenhead. As the town rapidly expanded in the 1840s, business leaders wanted to avoid the huge public health issues experienced by Liverpool, their neighbour, where even today Victorian cholera pits are often uncovered during construction. They decided to build a park at the centre of the town for everybody to enjoy and to improve the health of the local population. But did you know that Birkenhead Park inspired New York's Central Park? Around the same time, the city leaders in New York decided to start with a green heart for the expansion of Manhattan at a time when New York was also blighted by cholera epidemics. And so they organized a design competition for a new park. And of course, Frederick Law Olmsted entered the competition, but he traveled to Birkenhead, where he was inspired by the park designed by Joseph Paxton and subsequently won the competition for Central Park. And it's a beautiful green space. It's an oasis in the middle of the city, and 160 years later, It's as relevant today as it was then. It's a fantastic and iconic legacy for New York. Just look at it. We instinctively know that this is good for us. What we must remember is that city parks aren't luxuries, they are critical infrastructure. And as we turn to our current situation here in the UK, we are heading towards not quite such a normal recession. The government is looking to stimulate the economy, and driving ahead with the usual grey infrastructure and unsustainable projects is not the way forward. What I'm suggesting is, rather than build back better, we see it as must have to build back greener. We need to build back with nature. And if we are to build upon McHarg's legacy, we must work to expand the ambitions of landscape architecture and landscape professions. We must increase the power of the discipline to affect real change at a scale that's meaningful. And that's why the Landscape Institute is challenging our government to put the right policies in place to enable the fantastic designs, projects and ideas that we've seen at this event, put them into practice. The LI launched this greener recovery policy paper in September, and we're calling for a major shift from grey to green development as part of the UK's COVID-19 recovery plan. We're asking the UK government not to miss this once in a generation chance for a truly green recovery. And the policy is built on 5 principles. Each principle with recommendations to government. There's natural capital approach to infrastructure spend, investment in retrofit and maintenance of existing places, setting higher and fairer standards for green space, investment in natural solutions to climate change, and a step change in skills and digital data. So I'd like to pose a question. Are we at that tipping point or even pushing at an open door? Epidemics and pandemics have their own temporality. Panic dissipates very quickly and people very rarely follow up. And the current crisis, I feel, could be a once in a generation opportunity to take a step back, reassess fundamental assumptions about how our towns and cities are structured. So, moving swiftly on, I'd like to introduce our panel for this afternoon. I'll stop sharing my screen. We have a wonderful collection of speakers for you this afternoon, and when they will all present, and when they've finished, you will have an opportunity to put your questions to the panel. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Billy Fleming, who is the Wilkes Family Director of the Ian McHarg Centre at Wiseman School of Design, and a Senior Fellow with Data for Progress. His fellowship with Data for Progress is focused on the built environment impacts of climate change, resulting in the publication of low carbon public housing policy briefs tied to the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act introduced last year. In his role at McHarg Centre, Billy is the co-editor for the forthcoming book, An Adaptation Blueprint, and of course he was the co-editor and co-curator of the book, Design with Nature Now. Next, I would like to welcome Gullivar Shepard. Gullivar is a principal and guiding force at Michael van Valkenburgh Associates, steering the direction of many of the firm's largest projects. His training as an architect brings a strategic perspective to complex projects which include Brooklyn Bridge Park, Javits Federal Building Plaza in New York City, and the Port Lands in Toronto. He led the planning and design efforts for the White House's Pennsylvania Avenue project, amongst many other high-profile projects across North America. I'd also like to welcome Alice Shay from Borough Happold. Alice is a city planner and urban designer with over 10 years experience in New York City and beyond. Leading urban design and strategic planning projects with Borough Happold's city team, Alice brings insights for the delivery of high-quality public realm, accessible and sustainable community development and strategic planning. And finally, I'd like to introduce Mark Johnson.Civitas. Mark has over 30 years of experience as a landscape architect, and his creative leadership guides designers, project teams, and clients to push the edges of how Civitas work to realize new ways to deliver project value. Mark has led major public space projects, urban design plans and strategies, and has become widely known for his impact on several cities, education, and on the role that landscape architects can play. So it's lovely to see you all here this afternoon, and perhaps I'd like to invite Billy Fleming to present now. So Billy, if you'd like to share your screen. Hello,
Yeah,
Billy.
of course. Hi, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here with y'all today. Give me just 1 second and let me know, is that full screen for you?
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you again for having me. So I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done in the McHarg Center over the last almost 3 years now around the Green New Deal. Lots more I could say about the center we can maybe get into in the Q&A, but with the amount of time I have, I want to focus on this. And for me anyway, it's important to kind of begin just by thinking about what the Green New Deal actually is, as opposed to maybe the way it's often framed in, say, right-wing media, places in the United States. And if you just draw directly from the kind of language that was used to introduce it back in February 2019, this is in the non-binding House Resolution 109, calls for many things, but among them are these various provisions for channeling investments through a climate agenda into the built and natural environment, into the things that landscape architects, planners, and others in the built environment professions do every day and do really well. And I won't read through all of them, but among them, retrofitting every existing building in the country for maximum water and energy efficiency, overhauling the U.S. transportation system, investing in public lands, remediating every hazmat and brownfield site in the U.S. It is a lot of work, and as a resolution is intended as a framework, not a piece of standalone legislation. And it's also important for me to just also begin by noting here, right, that I often get asked, why focus on the Green New Deal? Why not on another climate plan? Why not, say, Project Drawdown or something like it? And there are lots of good reasons for that. Chief among them is that it's truly unique amongst American climate plans, and that it's actually trying to fuse the more technocratic demands around decarbonization with demands from blue-collar workers for jobs and like a fair economy, along with demands from frontline and fence-line communities for centering justice in the rollout of its investment program. Often previous climate plans have tried to do one or maybe two of these, none have tried to do three. When another one emerges that tries to do all three of these well, we'll happily take it up, but until then, this is the one we're focused on. And it's also, we normally spend a lot of time talking about the New Deal when I talk about the Green New Deal, in part because it represents such an important moment in political and cultural history in the US, and also because it's the central reference chosen by Green New Dealers. I won't spend a ton of time on it today. I'll just say a few things quickly. One is that the Green New Deal in many ways shares this kind of DNA with the New Deal. I'm pulling from Nancy Levinson of Places Journal here, who writes that the New Deal is best understood not as an overarching plan, but as a series of improvisations held together not by theory, but by strategy. And it's important to remember this, right, for the Green New Deal, and that it's not imagined as kind of a punch list we're checking off as we go over, say, the first 2, 3, 4 years of a favorable administration, but is meant to sort of define a decade-long plus a generation of policymaking that adheres to those jobs, justice, and decarbonization goals. And one of the last things I'll say about the New Deal too is that it's often imagined in the U.S. experience as providing, the framework that would give us the World War II mobilization that comes a few years later, as providing our only real universal program in this country, which is Social Security. But it also builds about 55,000 built environment projects around the U.S. Some of them very familiar to folks here, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Appalachian Regional Trail, but also, the pieces of everyday life that stitch together our communities and civic infrastructure. The post offices, the public schools, the housing, the sanitary sewer systems, the state parks, all of the things that we sort of take for granted in our built and natural environment today can trace, in large part their roots back to this era of the New Deal. And among the many things, I won't read through all of this, but among the many things, the New Deal offered or failed to offer was a real theory of power. So here, this is pulling from Brent Siebel, an historian here at Penn's, writing about it. But what the New Deal sort of failed to consider in its rollout of the investment side of its program was how it would be received by state and local government, who, at least in our system of government, really bear all the responsibility for implementation. And what that meant here is that, FDR and his colleagues just really didn't think or care all that much about who would be tasked with doing the implementation of, say, the multi-trillion-dollar New Deal investment program. And so when that money was channeled to places run by, say, sewer socialists in Minneapolis, it lengthened and strengthened their really progressive coalition, allowed it to flourish for longer than it would have otherwise. And when that money was channeled towards Jim Crow Dixiecrats in the South, it did the same for them. And you can go back through the built environment history of the New Deal to find, countless examples of the ways it reinscribed race and injustice into the U.S. landscape. And so for me in the center, taking on the Green New Deal has meant thinking about some of those failures in this more contemporary context, and trying to tie them back to a theory of change that sort of begins from the premise that no one will understand the energy transition or something like a Green New Deal through the carbon molecules in the atmosphere or the electrons in the circuits of their home. So we would never log on to Zoom like this in 2030 or 2040 and know sort of viscerally that our computers are powered by wind instead of coal, but we will know when like real investments are made in our home and our community and our transportation and our work through the rollout of something like a Green New Deal that makes most people, if not all people's quality of life better. And that for us in the center, that means that one of the things we can best sort of contribute to this moment, to this movement, is to take the more abstract demands of Green New Dealers, which often deal at that national or international level and with economic and technology and science policy, and translate them into compelling visions of the future that make these like quite radical ideas feel much more pragmatic and much more real. And so we've done that in kind of 4 ways I'll go through really quickly, and they've been sort of organized around these 2 research questions. One is, how do we balance the need to build as much as we've ever built, as fast as we've ever built it, with our responsibility to live up to, democratic principles of self-determination? And then how do we translate those demands of the climate justice movement into those compelling images of the future? One has been in the construction of a set of public tools, the first of which, the only one I'll show today, but the first of which is this project, an Atlas for the Green New Deal. This was developed in partnership with some friends at the Sunrise Movement and a few other places who came to, through the course of conversation with them about what we might be able to contribute to this work. It became clear that a big barrier for them, for their local groups, for some of their partners, was the sort of siloing and gatekeeping of critical climate and built environment data in the US, either behind academic journal paywalls or just otherwise in places otherwise inaccessible to most people who might want to use them to organize around. And so we took it upon ourselves to begin compiling as much of that as we could get our hands on, curating it into what we hoped was a beautiful set of images and maps and contextualizing sort of narrative and text, and making it available to anyone with an internet connection. So you can both peruse this atlas and use it in your sort of daily organizing work as you want. You can also download, any of the data we used on GitHub to use however you want in your own work. And so that's been one focus, has been this public tool construction. The second has been the sort of offering up of the school and the university's platform and resources to groups who are typically not invited in to have conversations about, how their radical visions for the future mesh or don't mesh with those that, typically occupy time in a school of design. And so here on stage, we have basically some of the national leaders of the Green New Deal movement and some international leaders of the Green New Deal movement, here at Penn this time last year, asking some of these same questions about how we move from abstract demand to concrete legislative agendas that drive implementation in communities all across the country. And on the stage there, you see at the podium my state rep in South Philly, Elizabeth Fiedler. Next to her is Karine Talo, who runs the government affairs program at WEACT, probably the oldest and most successful environmental justice org in New York. Next to her is Dave Roberts, writer at Vox. Next to him is Rihanna Gunn-Wright, who runs the climate program at the Roosevelt Institute here, probably the largest sort of left think tank in the US. Next to her is Leah Stokes, political science professor at UC Santa Barbara. And they're seated next to Allison Lassiter and Ellen Nisis of our faculty. And the day was structured around, again, taking these big abstract principles and sort of putting them into conversation with planners and designers about how to actually build the world the Green New Deal has promised. And this picture is particularly, I always like to include from this event, in part because the auditorium is full, and our provost, who opened the event for us that day, I think remarked, maybe not knowing it would be perceived as a joke, that this 1,400 person arena was as full as he'd ever seen it, fuller even than when our former faculty member, Joe Biden, used to hold events in here. And on stage there, you see Varshini Prakash sort of leading the crowd there in a song at the end of the day. Several of our faculty are there, along with a bunch of other folks from the left in the US. And to begin to kind of wrap us up, that has also included, after the event side, there's been this translation into sort of policy development within the center as well, and have focused again on taking these jobs justice carbon principles and putting them into actionable, concrete legislative text. In this case, in partnership with Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Sanders around public housing. This is part of a bill we helped them write last year, along with some supporting research, all of which you can always find here if you're really eager to dig into wonky legislative text. This is coupled with some work we've done around green stimulus, which we were part of the first group to really make this call and articulate a really comprehensive vision last March. So March 22 is the publication date you see there. This language, for the most part, got picked up by the now President-elect Biden campaign, continues to be drawn on as they get their transition plan together, and has became part of the impetus for us launching this new initiative in the McHarg Center, which really just formalizes these, once informal ad hoc networks in which we collaborate with a bunch of really compelling and mostly younger BIPOC scholars doing movement-connected climate justice work with sitting legislators. And this is a few of us, a couple days ago now, with incoming members of what's called the Justice Democrats Caucus in the US. So Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, Marie Newman, and have had similar calls like this with other incoming cohorts about how to channel their priorities in their first session in Congress around the Green New Deal into the housing, schools, civic infrastructure of their communities, the things that designers do really well. And here, I won't go through all the names, but this is the sort of initial pool of folks who are involved in that work with us. And the last thing, and I'll just zip through this really quickly because I don't want to take up too much time, has just been also the use of Studio as kind of an engine for all of these different parts to come together and to kind of push the work further. I'm currently in the second year of a 3-year Designing a Green New Deal Studio sequence in the school. In the first iteration, asked students to answer a couple of hard questions about where to prioritize investment through the rollout of a Green New Deal. They ultimately picked 3 regions, and I think picked pretty well. They chose Appalachia, the lower Mississippi Delta, and the Corn Belt of the Mississippi River. And then rather than asking them to solve a bunch of technical problems, asked them to stoke public imagination. How can we create images of the future in these places that were not about scarcity, not about having less, not about airplanes and hamburgers, but we're about plentiful, quality of life and abundance for the people who live there. And asked them to put together a bunch of kind of unfamiliar design products. These are propaganda posters, sort of archival objects from a future that's yet to happen, along with some more familiar drawings, in this case, showing the rollout of a clean energy program in a particular part of Appalachia. And then also some of these more, again, unconventional storytelling devices. So had a couple of students producing graphic novels. And rather than asking them to put up boards and talk about the work the way we typically do, where everyone wears all black and points at the board and really talks about themselves and not the work, ask them to curate a series of exhibition curators talks and to then have a set of panel discussions throughout the day about the work, about the topics. All of it lives here. Won't make you watch the full video of it, but we'll say, this is fed into what's now, being called the Green New Deal Super Studio. It's an effort we're co-leading with a bunch of other partners that has, I think, as of yesterday, about 160 other schools of design in the US running their own Green New Deal studios this academic year, in conversation with some of your colleagues there at the AA and with Commonwealth, the Commonwealth Fund in the UK to do a UK and or European version of this super studio next year, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. For me, in the second version of this studio this semester, we're back in the Midwest, Appalachia, and the Delta, and are focused on 3 industries: industrial agriculture, the fossil fuel system, and the prison industrial complex. And there are lots of reasons for that. The most important is that over the summer, the national organizing table for the Green New Deal world, which is called Green New Deal Network, that I sit on, merged with the sort of counterpart for the movement for Black Lives. So BLM and G&D merged over the summer in some respects. These are the industries they identified as the sort of critical ones. So that's where we're focused. And I won't go through all of this stuff in detail, but my students are now kind of churning through this in studio, looking at the co-location of prisons on abandoned coal mines in Appalachia, looking at the co-location of prisons on former plantation sites in the Mississippi Delta, and here looking at Angola, the state pen for Louisiana, which is named for the people who were kidnapped from Angola and brought to the United States, forced to work this land as enslaved laborers, and then in many cases put back into this facility as at least notionally free people later on. And you can see it looks and operates a lot today as it did back in 1901. Looking at some of their site plans for that. And they're now, they're at the point in their semester where they've constructed regional atlases of these industries in each region, and they're beginning to produce storytelling devices to talk about, again, like the possibilities that a Green New Deal might open up for each of these regions and its people if realized there, first and fully. And so with that, I will stop talking and turn it over to y'all for the next round of these.
Thanks, Billy. That was absolutely fascinating. Some of the graphics and diagrams are fabulous. They're really inspiring and provoking. I'm sure they're going to provoke a lot of discussion. Before I let you go, I'd like to ask you a question, Billy. How important is McHarg's legacy to you in your role? And how easy is it for you to win support for your mission?
Yeah, so the first question, I can't imagine doing any of this work without sort of McHarg's inspiration. I think he gets credited with lots of things. One thing we tend to forget, I think, is how willing he was to have some of these messier political and policy conversations and to lead work in the field that wasn't considered, say, core to landscape architecture at the time. And, frankly, that's how some of this work gets treated. I mean, not always here, but in other places as kind of not landscape architecture, too political, too whatever you want to call it. And, for all of my, many critiques of the kind of legacy we've been handed on the technocratic side from some of Ian's work, I can't imagine doing any of this public facing work without the work that, without the model he kind of created for us. Lots of things are different about it today than they were, in the 1960s and 70s. But I think the willingness to really pull in this massive non-design group of collaborators and speak to an audience and with an audience that is not primarily designers is pulled directly from Ian. I hope and think that's kind of the most obvious way the center is trying to kind of live up to the legacy he's left to us. And the second question I think was about how this work is perceived, right, Jane? Oh, you're muted. Sorry, go ahead.
How easy it is for you to win support for your mission?
I mean, frankly, it's not always the easiest. I think we have to fight for a lot of this stuff to be possible. Not always here institutionally, although sometimes, but also just within the field. I think one of the things, one of the sort of strategies behind holding that Green New Deal event here last year in September, which I think remains probably the biggest climate event Penn has ever held, probably the largest attended event the School of Design has ever put on, was that we knew, or I knew, that Penn generally, and the School of Design in particular, holds a particular amount of power in the design fields. For better or worse, is viewed as kind of a beacon for others. And so for us, it was important to take that event on, take this topic on, ask some different questions about who we align our sort of resources with, because we knew it would send signals to the rest of the field to begin, working on some of these questions they'd already been asking themselves too. In a way, it's a way for Penn to provide political cover to other places that want to and have been working on these questions for a while. And so I think, it's pretty obvious to me there'd be no, national Green New Deal super studio, probably no international Green New Deal super studio without that work that we led last year. And I also know even outside of design on some of these policy questions, some of the concretizing or the detailing of this from a very abstract and simple resolution that was 14 pages into what's now a pretty fleshed out agenda that covers housing, public land, agriculture, public schools, many aspects of the built and natural environment would not have been put together if not for some of this work. Lots of people have been involved in it. I don't want to pretend it's just us. We have lots of friends and colleagues who do this stuff with us. But yeah, I think it's been both really hard and absolutely worth it to take some of this stuff on.
Thank you very much for that, Billy. That was brilliant. So if I can ask you to, I think it happens automatically, doesn't it? So next up we have Gullivar Shepard, who is now going to present.
Great. Sorry you have to suffer through
Perfect.
the awkward moment that we have every day now.
Oh yes, we can
Yeah.
see that.
Great. I'm just going to go to full screen. I want to make sure everyone can still see this. Are we good? Thumbs up?
Still, I think it takes a little bit of time. It still hasn't come through yet. It's
Okay.
maybe just try it again.
How are we now?
That's perfect.
All right, great.
There you go.
So thank you, everyone. I'm Gullivar. Nice to see you all. I'm with Michael van Valkenburgh Associates, and I really appreciate being able to have this opportunity to talk about a project that is about 10 blocks from our office in Brooklyn, and has been about 20 years. Well, when it is completed in a couple of years, it will be about almost 20 years in the making, design, and construction. And I love this photo perhaps most of all for a couple of reasons of the project, because these moments where you're lost in the spectacle of nature, in extreme contrast to where it is located, which is in the center of arguably one of the most intensely urban places in the country. And I'm also saying this in the context of it's a waterfront project, and for 15, 20 years, we have also been inundated with this imagery of iconic waterfronts. But when you go to these places, one of the most fulfilling experiences in this is the reason we design with nature is that it's so beneficial to us. And it's this kind of moment that you walk away from a visit to the park that I think sticks with you the most and has the most impact. So this is to my point of where it is located. It's about 70 acres, but in sort of a chicken strip that wraps itself around the east side of the East River. Has a clearly a pastiche of industrial and infrastructural shapes from its footprint onto the river. Talk more about that as well. This is the park today. You get a sense, so you get a vibe of just the intensity of city around it and the greenery, but you of course can still see the industrial footprint of these piers and bulkheads and infrastructure and highways and bridges that represent hundreds of millions of dollars of important city infrastructure. But the greening, how to bring nature into this, is what I'm speaking about today. And what I'm going to do is walk back just really quickly. This is when we encountered the site first, almost 20 years ago, as I suggested, where these giant sheds, massive concrete piers, were so massive that even when you have these windows to the water, you had no sense of being on the harbor. There were just these slots and windows and just completely hard pavements. And that highway right there is cantilevered, Robert Moses special, so it produced a tremendous amount of sound. It was not a loved place. In fact, during the public engagement, one of the things that was constantly thrown our way was, who's going to come here? It's because of that highway, there's very few moments of access to get to this. And true, when you went to the site, you would see a rundown warehouse full of dead pinball machines, an NYPD training facility, no boat activity anymore. It's all vehicle served, because that had dried up. I'll get to that in a minute. And including a mafia chop shop that we had to try to get rid of on this site. So it has an incredibly weird accrual of things on the waterfront, and that's why I want to do this with you. First, the piers, and they are shaped the way they are, not as the sort of traditional finger piers in the river that you see that align with roads, because this was a small window of maritime innovation, that instead of unloading off of a ship and then getting it onto a cart or a car and taking it to a warehouse or a business, just put the warehouses right there where you unload. And that was seen as a great thing. This was all, the small window was eclipsed by the invention of the shipping container, of course. But what is fundamentally important here is that we ended up with these very large piers, 5 acres each. going further back, you know, Robert Mose's mission to sort of help rid congestion in this rapidly growing metropolis with that construction of that highway. Going further back, the waterfront, previously these little private piers, there were no right-of-ways. These were just businesses that had private connections to water. Going further back, you can see as Brooklyn was becoming its own economic township, you know, second to Manhattan, the encroachment of what was this bluff between the Brooklyn Heights and the East River in terms of maritime parallel parking before there were piers, and these sort of unusual structures of the mercantile class having villas and then warehouses at this lower level. A wonderful expression of that relationship being this, I don't know if you saw it in the lower right in this image, this one moment of access along this mile-long edge between what was described as a very seedy waterfront, complete with recurrent reports of pirates that would go through this threshold and raid the town and come back, and if you hadn't caught them by then, you'd never find them. And then this sort of domesticated bluff at the top. And then going further back, remembering that this is an estuary, that the tidal flats, the salt marshes, the emergent landscapes, the kind of planting varieties that were here were just being colonized early on by human settlements and industry. So jumping back to today, or when we started the project, we started accruing not only all of these historic layers, but then, you know, this is now a major global city with all sorts of infrastructure, and we had basically a jurisdictional soup. We had 5 subways going underneath our site, and these points where the subway plunges underneath the river had never been encountered with a design project, and so all the people who had designed them had long since passed away. So we had a very conservative kind of administrative treatment around those. All the piers were actually administratively part of Manhattan, and the upland was part of Brooklyn, because Manhattan, being the center of power and controls of money, wanted the money makers. So that made permitting an immediate challenge, that we would have to talk to Brooklyn and Manhattan separately. The CSOs, the fact that there was state, federal, and city land right-of-ways, historic view sheds, it made it, I think, like many intensely urban waterfronts, you suddenly start uncovering all sorts of material. And this is where I'm going to take a quick pause and just say, like, this is an image when we started to demolish the sheds and actually really see what we had as a piece of land, which was basically a pancake with marine edge, one kind of edge all the way through. And what we had done in the design process is, the first thing is we'd gotten a boat, and we all traveled around all the edges of New York, and it basically was just all of this kind of marine edge. There was no engagement of water. Everything was set back in terms of planting. And we saw this as a tremendous opportunity to sort of, for maybe the first time, challenge some of this marine engineering. And so this loosely held notion of reverse engineering, meaning literally what could we remove of this engineering, but also reverse engineering this, like, that nature was here, nature was still operating, and we followed the breadcrumbs of how it was working. But also importantly, reverse engineering this as a larger structure and land water relationship, because we had the very unusual position of not just being landscape architects, but having to develop an urban design and financial scenario where we would have certain development parcels that would pay in an ongoing basis the maintenance and operations of this park. The city and the state would put up the money to fund this project in its construction, but would not put a dime forward on how to maintain it forever. So this put us in we really had to think about, you know, this was owned by a port authority that has an incredible amount of influx of money. When it goes to the Parks Department, as you all know, that does not happen that way. So we had to come up with this way of paying for the jacketing of piles, since 40% of the site is on structure, or how we could design this in such a way to be more resilient, more self-sustaining, and ultimately more pragmatic with the forces of nature that had been basically resisted for 100 years. So I'm going to, now at this point, sort of organize this around three sort of working conceits that came up in the early planning and that we've sort of held to relative to both building a park program to serve Brooklyn, but also to dampen the engineering and let nature back in, because it was basically built around stamping out any kind of that sort of erosive force. And that those names are we loosely called sort of looking for the benefits of edge complexity, a concept of structural economy, and microclimatic forces in form. So with edge complexity, I think you get the idea. I've sort of talked quite a bit about that. It really started with this plan where it's a very unpleasant job of marine. You have to hire marine people to actually walk through the muck and inspect all the structure you can't see from the top. You have to be in the water to understand the relieving platforms, the wharfs, the piers and pile caps, the spans over subways. And so obviously things that were red were desperately in trouble and gray, and some were in better condition than others. So our concept here is we had that sort of monochromatic edge, almost 2.5 miles of it, and that through a series of operations looking at what we should keep and what we could rip out, like what in the diagram number 2, adding 3/4 of a mile just for removals, a bunch of floating walks that would help connect these very vast piers at the water's edge, and then cutting into the land to create a more natural, resilient edges. And we sort of nearly double the amount of edge, and the edge is program. That's sort of one of the models we had going through this. So here's a depiction of what the site was, just this complete covered erasure of the tides of an estuary. It basically was a no-life zone in the shadow of these piers, which were acres in scale. And our idea about how to pull back and reveal this connection of water and land once again was perhaps one of the central engines for what we think we accomplished here. Leaving the piles because they had tremendous value for the ecology of the estuary, and bringing back salt marsh that had basically been eliminated from the harbor. So this was a very exciting moment, our first moment because you can look at all the plans you want, and there weren't many. They were actually most of them were stored in the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened. So we had very few records to go off. So actually when we were in the act of physically ripping apart, it was breathtaking to see this connection begin to happen in front of our eyes. So this is this pier where you can see maybe that clearing in the pile field in the lower left where one of the subway tunnels was, and this cut between the buildings and the park where an old bulkhead that had been rotting in the brinish groundwater was removed. And this became the engine to a whole new system of site water treatments, letting the tide into this landscape and bringing people into it with a variety of experiences of nature. This is one of those moments where you're seeing the salt marsh, the tide starting to flood the salt marsh, and being able to clamber out and get up close to that, something that, again, from that original boat ride, we didn't see the ability to ever come in contact with water, and we think we're very much wired to respond to that. Creating actual programmatic access for like this untapped resource of being able to paddle around in some safe water environments, or simply get people closer to the water, being mission number 1. Another instance, a pier further to the south, you can see there was this amazing machine that was like a bandsaw on tracks that just sawed this 300-foot wide pier off of the land, and it revealed this like virtual hypo-style hall. And this is what you can see to the left side of that. There are these spans over additional subway tubes, and we created this sort of metaphoric slip where you could launch boats into the protected waterways, but it was allowing you to see the infrastructure that was there, but also understand the tides, because with 4 or 5 feet of rise, the water would be in different locations in this gradient pathway and go in a counterclockwise. It would sort of change the nature of feeling the site.
Gulliver, could you start to wrap up now, please?
Yes, we're almost there. A salt marsh sluice that would fill with water, the city's first beach, and actually touching the water. And this goes very fast. The structural economy concept was simply taking this idea that too much money would be invested to try to put heavy things on the piers, and that the land should be robustly using topography and plants. And you can see in this diagram. So just to flip through some of these images of this intense, robust nature and crusting with people and paths and ways you can sort of hike, go on your daily jog through water gardens, playground that had a total immersion in nature, playing with water and slides and changes of views with Slide Mountain, versus the flat landscapes on these piers. This wonderful set of soccer pitches in the shadow of the skyline, used all day round. Picnic peninsulas, a temple to basketball and court sports and roller skating out there, and sand volleyball. All of this loved to death. And just the final few slides about the microclimactic form, how brutal this was at the very edges of the piers, with boats coming within 100 feet of these edges, wind whipped, inboard, the kind of these erosive forces of the wave actions on the land edges, and that nature did have some, in the shadow of the former bluff, now a highway, had actually a wind shadow that was something to take advantage of. And then the highway itself that created 82 decibels of sound trumpeted across the parkland led us to this recreation of the bluff that abated the sound and created a background of the bluff line. And then so the actual tree landscape shrub thing became a series of very linear, parallel to the river pieces that would meet and join, as you can see here. And just through the small addition of these narrow, robust planting edges, you could feel this great expanse of the city, but also feel completely pulled away from it. So thank you very much for this. I just wanted to be able to show you those images and hopefully communicate some of the feelings of designing with nature in an incredibly industrial, intensely urban environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Gulliver. That was absolutely fascinating, and there's so many nice comments in the chat. I have questions that we'd like to ask you, but sadly we've got a couple of other speakers. We'll come back to those questions later. I'm sure we could have talked for an hour or more about your project. It was a fantastic example of a sort of retrofitting in a city and bringing nature back in. So thank you very much for that, Gulliver. Next, I would like to introduce Alice Shay from Borough Happold, who's going to present for the next 15 minutes. Alice, are you ready?
Hi. Yes.
Excellent.
Let me pull up the screen here. And I will go full screen. How does that look?
Perfect.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it's wonderful to be part of this panel. I listened in a little bit yesterday, and such a dynamic set of speakers and great conversations, and I think extremely pertinent today, you know, how we're looking at our infrastructural landscapes and urban landscapes. So I'm with Borough Happold, Associate Principal within the City Strategy Team. We do consulting and engineering. I'm going to talk a little bit about an idea proposition that we have called Stranded Assets, and then one of the exemplars of this work, the Reimagine the Canal effort. So as urban strategists and engineers, we are deeply invested in public infrastructure. I think, as everyone would agree, infrastructure is our collective investment in the functioning of our urban agglomerations. Cities are places where people can live together equitably and resiliently because of the mutual benefit that is derived from the economies of scale of large public infrastructure, such as bridges, such as waterways, such as urban systems. However, much of our city's urban infrastructure was built in the early and mid 20th century, and so much of it is aging out now. There are drivers for this stranding: regulatory change, environmental issues, particularly around climate change, economic stranding, when we have transitions in production and distribution that drive infrastructure needs to be different today, and technological stranding, where mobility is shifting the way we deal with our waste, and the infrastructure that undergirds that also must transform. And there's a detriment to these underutilized and underinvested stranded assets. They can produce safety concerns, security issues, catalyze more disinvestment, ecological degradation, and produce negative externalities in terms of land uses in our neighborhoods. We at Buro Happold are really engaged with the idea of adaptive reuse of these large public infrastructure. We've had the opportunity to work on quite a few of these, be it the High Line. We were involved with the design firms from the outset and the concepts for the adaptive reuse of that elevated rail line that's so famous into the park that it is today. Also being engaged at looking at transitioning land uses across districts. This is a North Brooklyn industrial business zone that is looking to be more maker-oriented, is seeing the pressures of real estate development for residential, but is a real kind of safe zone of jobs for all. Also looking at infrastructure of that is the scar of urban renewal that was seen across our country in cities like Richmond, and how these separators and barriers can actually be infrastructures to bring people together and knit neighborhoods back. We've also worked on a range of different waterway infrastructure and looking at how that it can be more resilient and better positioned for the future. This example in the center, the Erie Canal, is one I'll jump into in a little bit more depth. The Erie Canal is a massive, historically incredibly important piece of infrastructure for New York City and New York State and the country at large. It is located in its site because it is the one navigable break in the Appalachian Mountain Range. The current New York Canal system is 525 miles in length, consisting of 4 different canals. But this system was never one thing. It has evolved and transformed over its lifetime because of different changes in technologies. So this is a map of the first Erie Canal route, which was entirely man-made. The former governor, DeWitt Clinton, came to Congress and said, let's do this thing. I want to make New York City competitive and open up trade from the coast to the Great Lakes. It was called DeWitt's Folly initially, but it was immediately incredibly successful and paid itself back within 10 years. It's the first iteration had mule-drawn boats, and then the second iteration, it was expanded to carry steamships. And then in the early 20th century, it was expanded once again to be able to compete with the railroads. So in this iteration, they actually moved the route of the canal and canalized natural waterways. So the Mohawk River being the main one. You can see the images here of this gigantic mechanized infrastructure that was used to ensure that the water could be deep enough to have ocean-faring vessels travel across the new route. These are movable dams, unique, beautiful structures. This is a large guillotine lock, and then the guard gate in the image to the right. The story of the canal has lived many different lives within its duration. Initially it was incredibly successful, and then as it was competing with the railroads, it just couldn't keep up. It was expanded, had a brief period of success in the mid 20th century, but then by the 50s, with containerization, shipping on waterway became obsolete. You really can't compete with a route that takes a week to travel down for shipping versus a day or less by highway. However, it's an incredibly important piece of infrastructure for New York State history. It is why New York City is the mercantile capital that it is, and it opened up trade to the Midwest and all across the country. So incredibly important, and a waterway that can have new benefits. We really see it as an asset that is in the process of stranding, but can have a new life. So we were brought on by the New York Power Authority in 2017 to run an ideas competition, to kind of generate big, new, innovative ideas for the future of the canal. This was not run like a typical ideas competition where we had kind of apples to apples designs. We really were garnering big ideas from all different disciplines. And so these were our 7 finalists projects, and each of them offers a new model for the future of the canal. We've got tourism, we've got regeneration of industrial properties, cultural regeneration, using the canal system to provide water to farms through irrigation, ecological restoration, accommodations to support more types of tourism. So a wide range of ideas. And we got 145 submissions for the competition, and it really catalyzed a lot of excitement about looking at the canal in a new way. So then we were asked by Governor Cuomo and the New York Power Authority to run a task force, a 6-month task force bringing together 5 state agencies as well as key leadership from across New York State. They vetted the ideas from the competition, expanded them, tested, how can these different concepts be combined, be looked at in a new way? How can we see the system as providing multiple array of benefits as opposed to just being focused on its original mandate of commercial shipping? So through this task force, we came up with a vision for the canal centered around 4 key concepts: resilience, regeneration, restoration, and reuse. In terms of resilience, the canal system, because it is this mechanized waterway with elevated water levels for shipping, it causes dramatic flooding issues as well as ice jams, which are essentially riverine icebergs that when they move, they just plow into anything that's in their way. So we were looking at ways that you could operate the canal system differently to mitigate those flooding issues to canal-side communities. We're also looking at ways that the canal can continue to be an economic engine for upstate, but instead of being about transportation, could be around tourism, agriculture, supporting local businesses. We're also interested in ways that it could be repositioned to focus on ecological restoration. The canal system, because of this management of water levels, causes drought and then inundation to wetland and riparian areas across the state, damaging those environments and dramatically decreasing habitat quality. But if you could moderate that system differently, you could actually regenerate some of these wetlands. And then lastly, the idea of reuse. The canal is so important to the history of the state. And it has this beautiful, iconic, gigantic infrastructure all along. How can those actually be monuments to the ingenuity and innovation and continued success of these upstate towns? So the task force presented these concepts to Governor Cuomo and the leadership of the New York Power Authority, which is the agency that oversees the canal. And there was a lot of enthusiasm around it. And in this year's State of the State, Governor Cuomo committed $300 million of investment to reimagining and repositioning the Erie Canal over the next 5 years. $100 million to economic development projects, and then $200 to resilience studies and new initiatives. Some of these projects, I'll just show kind of examples of some of the ones that were invested for the first phase. So these are under implementation right now, and we're hoping to have each of these built out with the next 5 years. So the first project is looking at an adaptive reuse of a guard gate to be a bridge spanning the canal. This is in Brockport in Western New York. So there's a university to the right in the foreground, and then there's the Empire State Trail, which is a 200-mile-long trail that goes all across New York State. And how to actually adaptively reuse this infrastructure so it can be the kind of foundation for new types of connections between communities and support new types of recreation. We also are working with a lighting designer to illuminate some of these fantastic infrastructural beacons. This is a movable dam in Amsterdam, New York. And we're planning a whole series of programmatic interventions as well at this site to combine glamping with the Empire State Trail and programming around the new illumination of these structures. And this is an example. We're actually working with Gullivar's for Michael van Valkenburgh on this project here, which is at the top of the Finger Lakes in Cayuga. At the back of the rendering here, you can see a tainter gate. So this is a piece of infrastructure that modulates the water flow from the Finger Lakes into the canal. And if you operate that differently, you can actually create the foundation for a whitewater course here. In the past, people think the canal, they think, you know, big steamships and barges, but actually the canal can be a place for human-powered recreation and ecotourism. This also sits next to the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, which is a major stopover in the North Atlantic Flyway. And so by supporting the ecological restoration, you actually can bring more people to the region because of the kind of beautiful flora and fauna that can be supported by the repositioning of the canal and regeneration of these habitats. This is one of, this project is one of our winners from the design competition or ideas competition. All of the towns along the canal grew because the canal was there. They're all industry towns. Amsterdam produced carpets, Canajoharie was canning food products, other towns produced rugs or brooms. But you know, with the transition in industry across the country, much industry and production has left this region. And so there's a lot of disinvested, underutilized industrial properties and structures along the system. So we looked at how you could have a new model for waterfront development applicable upstate. So this parcel here in the town of Canastota is actually out for RFP right now. The municipality is working with a set of developers to do a new live work development that really has the public realm focused on the canal, and that is a driver for real estate development in the region. It's a model we're looking at that could be replicated across the system. And then the last economic development project, we're looking at, this is another adaptive reuse. This is Guy Park Manor in Amsterdam, New York. And we're adaptively reusing it so it could be a hospitality venue. And then also looking at transforming that movable dam to add a pedestrian bridge across that would connect to the Empire State Trail. As we know in economic development, you know, improving quality of life for local communities is essential, but you also, to add real kind of new dollars to the region, you need to get visitors from afar. And so we're looking at how you could take these interventions, look at places that have a little catalytic energy already, and combine some of those new interventions to create destinations that will pull people from New York City, Chicago, Toronto. And so this is one of those examples. And then we have a slew of resiliency strategies that we're working on. Here's an image of one of those ice jams that happens almost every year. And moderating the water flow and also the operation of these dams in a new way that can decrease the amount of flooding and damage that's caused by ice jams. This is an example of Montezuma, the top right, and the regeneration of wetlands. This to the bottom left is you can just slightly see it. There's some siphons that pull from the canal into this farm adjacent. Farms, because of climate change, there's many farms in Western New York, but they're seeing challenges due to drought as a result of climate change. And by providing more steady streams of irrigation to these farms, they can actually expand their growing season and grow higher value crops. And of course, there's ancillary benefits beyond the farmers themselves in production and packaging for that region that is, you know, has a lot of kind of economic challenges. And kind of sidebar to the work that we were doing around irrigation, you can flow water from the canal into adjacent streams, and Western New York has a great fishing community. And there's 1 week a year when everyone storms because they release water from the canal into the streams. And if we actually moderate that outflow of water in a more seasonal way, we could actually expand that angling season to bring more fishing tourists to the region.
Alice, could you move it on now, please? Thank you.
Yep. all done here. So I just, in terms of this project, looking at a piece of infrastructure that is really a kind of mega infrastructural landscape, and in taking it on and shifting its mandate from being monopurpose to multi-purpose, and to provide a range of different benefits to communities. And then lastly, I think, within the design community, so frequently we come in at the end of the brief process, but actually being involved in the ideation from the very outset can really help us transform our infrastructure in new ways. So thank you.
Thank you, Alice. They are amazing images and ideas for repurposing a canal. I think it's so important that we reuse our old infrastructure, and actually the collaboration between our landscape architect and engineer is so important, and it's really refreshing to hear your take on it. So thank you so much for that, Alice. That was really excellent. Thank you. So finally, our final speaker this afternoon before we go into the Q&A is Mark Johnson, who's the founding partner of Gravitas. Mark, the stage is yours.
Thank you.
That's great. We can see that. Thank
Good.
you.
Thanks. And can you hear me well? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor. Nice to see so many friends on the screen. I was asked to talk about something that we made a real focus of about 20 years ago, which is to start to make change in second and third tier cities, or what I've called everyday cities, cities that exist within their own context. They may have many connections to the world for economic or other reasons, but they're fundamentally local. And I happen to be I'm from Chicago, and I was at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, which led as part of protests in support of the anti-war, pro-environment movement. And about 2 years later, I was introduced to Ian's book, Design with Nature. And I shortly after went to work for this fellow, a guy named Grant Jones, who for a long time was the poet laureate of the city of Seattle. And remains my best friend, but as a poet, Grant was always looking for meaning in everything. And I was at the office one day. We were actually doing the weirdest combination of work. We were doing major river and watershed studies across the Northwest and Alaska. And we were also zoo designers. And one day, this chap walked into the conference room with Nader Ardalan. Nader was his client for a project called Partisan, a zoo outside of Tehran. And so I met Ian in 1977 or 8, something like that. And we worked together on that for a while. And when Ronald Reagan got elected, I was so disheartened because I was so passionate about the environmental movement, working on zoos, wildlife, and habitats, and all of those sorts of things. And all of that work kind of vanished when Reagan got elected. And I went into, one of those personal tailspins that young people do. And I switched. I decided to go to the Harvard GSD to get a degree in urban design, because as a city kid, I figured if I couldn't save the environment, maybe I could make cities better. So I'd only been there 3 months at the GSD when I saw that Ian was coming to speak. And since I knew him, I said to Jerry McHugh, the dean, I'll pick him up at the airport. He said, that'll be great. So I went and met him at Logan Airport, and we got to the car. And as we started driving, I said, Ian, open the glove box. And he opened the glove box and his face lit up and he turned to me and he said, real gentleman. Because in the glove box, I had a pack of cigarettes, a pint of whiskey, and 2 glasses. And he stuck a cigarette in my mouth and lit it. And he poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and off we went to the GSD for his lecture. After the GSD, I started my firm called Civitas, where our mission has been since 1983 to engage people with nature in cities. But what is the nature of cities? This is Boston Harbor. When I talk about an everyday city, I'm talking about a city that is deeply situated because of its ecological context or the ecostructure of the place. And just using Boston as an example, this is a very simplistic map of Boston. You can see the areas called Landfill, the Shawmut Peninsula, Long Wharf. Long Wharf is the Long Wharf because it got out into the deeper part of the harbor for the ships coming from the old world. The red dot is where the State House was placed on top of the hill because humans generally plant the flag at the top. In a very brief period, State Street emerged between the State House and Long Wharf, surrounded by the financial district. So the commercial center attaching the new world to the old and the wharf, the political center on top of the hill, and the finance district opens up between. And then, as I like to joke, because pilgrims weren't stupid, the common is on the sunny side of the hill on the south. So this is what that looked like probably about 200 some years ago. And it still persists. On the left, you have the State House. On the right, you have Long Wharf. And that original eco-structure from deep water to hilltop, combined with the sunny side of the hill, has formed the basis and backbone of this terrific city. And then with the addition of design, we've created a structure of a cultural and economic engine that is absolutely bound to the original ecological structure of the place. And when you think about it, you immediately know that everything is sort of in its place. You'll never see a tower in Beacon Hill on the left, and you'll never see a little townhouse in the financial district, because these patterns have been fixed and were fixed by the original settlers very, very quickly. As new technologies come, we adapt, but these structures are resilient. So everyday cities, I'm going to talk about two, Calgary and Brno. Brno is in the Czech Republic. In Calgary, we did something, an incision, something very, very small and impactful. And in Brno, we're working on something very big and also impactful. But everyday cities, in my mind, have their roots in this idea of an eco-structure. So people come to a place, they find water, they find soils that can support agriculture, and they build their village, their town, their city on the backs of the economy and technology of their time. And as the economy and technology change, you see shifts in how cities grow, but they remain bound to this structure. That context is essentially never changing. And one of the things I love about these everyday cities is that people generally understand their identity and agency of who they are within the place. So our practice, for example, we work across Canada, the US, and offshore, but by looking at these smaller cities, which have a very clear sense of identity, a very clear sense of agency, and the ability to pull together to make things happen. We have found rich soil for our work and our thinking, and have been able to create some pretty exciting outcomes. So Calgary sits here. On the left, you see the Rocky Mountains. On the right, you see the Great Plains. It really is the political and economic link, center, and engine that ties mountain and plain together, all based in the core resources of this place. And you can see from where it says Kananaskis through Cochrane to Calgary, the Bow River, a beautiful, beautiful wild river coming out of the Rocky Mountains. And on the lower left of the screen, you see the Elbow River. So I think it's quite amusing, the bow and the elbow. And they have a confluence where Calgary was founded. So here you see downtown Calgary with the bow The kind of curvilinear brown area is a bluff, and you can see how the city remains shaped by these forces. And on the lower right, there is a pointy island called St. Patrick's Island. This is what it looked like about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. It had been a park. It was a campground in the teens and 20s, Model T, when car camping and that sort of travel hit. This was rip-rapped, flattened, flooded many times, and when we arrived was the center of drug and sex crime in Calgary because it was isolated in the heart of the city. With a great deal of public engagement, we realized that the highest and best use of this island was to put new life back into nature and to bring the children and people of Calgary into nature right in the heart of the city. So you can walk from City Hall here in 7 or 8 minutes. And we, with a lot of historical research, we found that originally the first settler was a guy named John King, who was with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the precursor to that organization. And he camped on this island because it was safe from the First Nations people that surrounded. And the city really began here. So now I'm having trouble advancing, hold on. We found it had been 3 islands. So we reopened this breach across the island. I am a whitewater canoeist and kayaker, and I have a deep understanding of how water works. And by making what I refer to as a triple eddy, even in the highest flows, this breach is a safe place for children because we've changed the velocity of the water. So you can go to this place today and wade and swim and play in a beautiful, clean mountain stream. And you can get there on the light rail, you can get there on the bus, you can take your bike, or you can walk. So for the first time, inner city kids who don't have access to the national park, et cetera, have this resource right at home. Here's, you get a sense of what we also did. That rather odd sort of footprint shape on the left is a hill that's 10 meters high. That is the soil we cut from the breach to open up the land. And when we showed this to the mayor, he said to me, "Can we really have that?" And I said, "Of course." And he said, "How could you get that approved?" I said, "Well, we're doing so much ecological restoration and we're opening up so much recreation in nature in the city. I think we've got a story that will succeed." And it wasn't easy, but we did get it approved because when you think about it, even though the hill is 10 meters high, the maximum flood only goes up 1 meter to the bottom of the hill. So the other 9 meters don't matter. We created a 1,000-foot long wetland. This was a lawn. We call this the low water crossing. So it's become a really beloved place just in the 4 years that it's been open. Then at another extreme, the city of Brno in the Czech Republic sits on a hill near a river. And it's a somewhat concentric city because the hill is sort of a circle. And down on the in that green woodland that you see threading along is the river. I can't speak Czech very well. The Svitava and Stravka rivers have a confluence here. That's why Brno is here. And this is the site that we are working on. You can see the cathedral, which is in the old city in the distance. And the lower picture is from the cathedral looking back towards the river. And this is floodplain, which is why it has never been developed. So even though this is a really ancient city, I am standing here just 3,000 meters from that cathedral. And what we are doing is relocating the central train station to the point where I'm standing, which will open up an entirely new quarter of the city. allow us to move the trains and to introduce a massive green system to connect the old city to its river. So here you see where the trains were and the old station at the end of that green corridor. By removing the tracks, we're making a green connection down to embrace the Svitava River. And the large rectangle on the right center part of the screen is the location of the new train station. This project has already made a dramatic impact. We are hoping that by next Monday, the city will announce the short list for an international competition to design the new station. So it's actually going to happen. And now I have a very simple little video. It runs kind of quickly, but I don't like long video. So this will just give you an overview. Here's the site and the river and the trains, the sense of expanse. We're creating a new boulevard that leads to the old station, and then the green corridor that will form the heart of this massive city expansion, tying down to the river itself and a large park space. I'm working with 7 different architecture firms on this because 7 of these buildings are now in design development. My client is actually the property owner, but obviously a property owner with real vision. We've been working in partnership with the city staff, the mayor's office, and city council of Brno for almost 3 years now. And I couldn't be more excited to say, I think this is really going to happen. So just to bring it to a close, I think you can see that I have focused my career on really trying to use nature to make transformations in city spaces and to engage people with those places. And that is something I learned personally from Ian. He taught me how important it was to not just to think of nature, but to look at what are the real issues of your time and how can you as a designer make an impact to improve the life of the world and the life of people against the contemporary forces that we face. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was the absolutely perfect way to end these speaker sessions. I particularly enjoyed your project in Calgary. I know it well. I've actually cycled across onto those islands.
Oh,
They're
good,
fabulous.
good.
So yeah, Calgary is definitely better for that project. So thank you. Now, this is a point in the proceedings where we can ask the contributors some questions. So please write any questions down in the chat box, and I'll try and pick them up as we go along. And I'm sure some of the others in the team will do so. But I've got a few to start us off. So, Billy, as you haven't spoken for a while, I'll start with you. David Hawes has asked if you are engaging with the RIBA here in the UK for the Super Studio initiative. And somebody else, I think it's Rosenburn, has also asked, are the exhibitions available online?
Yeah, so the short answer to the RIBA question is not yet, but I think that's coming. So I had my first call with folks at the AA and Commonwealth maybe 2 weeks ago. And I think they're looking to sort of begin formalizing, putting together a UK super studio in the coming weeks or months. So I think that'll happen pretty soon, but anybody who wants to connect me to anyone at RIBA to talk more about this should feel free to do so. Always happy to have that conversation. The exhibitions do live online. So I'm happy to drop a couple of links in here for folks to check out. There'll also be a more expansive page on the McHarg site, probably early next year. That includes a bit more of that stuff, and we'll continue to add to it as we churn out content in the studio.
That's great. And are you engaging at all with the LI here in the UK?
We haven't yet, but again, very happy to do all of that. I've kind of deferred to my contacts at the AA to put their UK coalition together, but would love to bring as many people in as possible.
Yeah, it'd be great to coordinate with you on and collaborate with you, Billy. So that would be fantastic. Thank you. Perhaps I could ask a question of Gullivar. Your amazing project in Brooklyn. I must go and visit it. It was fantastic, and it was just incredible to see how you were able to repurpose that infrastructure and give it a new lease of life by bringing it back to nature. It was just superb. But how easy was it to get the developer and the landowners to buy into your vision?
Well, it's a very different scenario. This was Port Authority land who gifted it to the Parks Department. But it was actually, we had to, actually it was given to the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation, which was a separate state and city conjoined entity. It ultimately would go to the city to do a lot of the management, however. I guess from the development side, like I mentioned in the presentation, that was really a unique charge given to a landscape architect to figure out how to package, shape, and financially assess this development. The master plan, the original master plan that was approved by the community, which opened the floodgates for city and state funding, said that we were allowed to use 20% of the footprint of the park for development. And what I'm going to is we ended up only using 10%, but people still hated us through the entire process. It was just a brutal thing. We actually have slides of all the local newspaper headlines it was just development should not happen here. And no matter how scientific and how reasonable we tried to make the discussion, it was just quite a sensational process. But we made it, and it really took the first phase of implementation to have to let people see oh my gosh, what an impact this is having on my Brooklyn. And when you go there today, you don't even think about the development. It's just not in your face. I don't know. So we were set up for a very hard challenge. I'll say that, because there is, of course, and still is, quite a anti-development segment out there,
Yeah.
and I understand it. But it's very hard to walk that line. Again, we're landscape architects and designers are not always invited to the table to try to hold those proceedings, and that was an education in and of itself. I'm sure some people can appreciate.
Yes, I can imagine. How long were you in the design phase for the project?
Well, like I said, I think one of the coolest things about the way that this project happened was it was doled out in pieces. So the first construction was realized in 2008, and will be continuing till 2022. And you got to remember, like I said at the beginning, people were wondering who will ever come here. There's no way to get to it. There's nothing. It's quite awful. There's a highway. And now, last summer, we had 5 million people visit it in the summer. So it's a screaming success. And so that doling out of pieces has just added to the flame. Like I think if we had built it all at once, it almost wouldn't be as successful. It's like allowed us to sort of calibrate and move and adjust to what the community was saying. Like, oh, we need more play program, because now people are coming and we're having people traveling from Queens and all sorts of different districts that we didn't anticipate, who just come for the play equipment. It's that much of a draw. So I really, that slightly more organic way. So we've been designing and building continuously. And actually, just interestingly, we are on a team to address the reconstruction of that highway that was bounding the site. And that is now being leveraged to become a 4-acre expansion of the park, which allows us to perhaps in the future do one more round to grow the park.
Thanks, Gulliver. Alice, I've got a question for you. So some engineering practices become a sort of one-stop shop, you know, the big multidisciplinaries where you offer the full service, but Borough Happold tends to work closely with and support leading landscape and architectural designers, and that's absolutely brilliant that you do. Do you find that this adds a special USP to Borough Happold's business culture?
Definitely. I think, you know, Borough Happold is a kind of, unique within the kind of larger engineering firms, because they really see themselves, we as a firm see ourselves as both being engineers and consultants. And I sit within the city strategies team. So my background is not in engineering, it's planning and urban design. But, you know, as a culture, we're very adaptive, you know, whatever is the project, whatever is the brief, putting together a team that is the kind of best set of practitioners to tackle that given challenge. And so we love working with designers, we love working with academics on our teams. We really kind of are happy to be extremely collaborative. And I think as a result, we get to work on highly innovative projects.
Yeah, I think you the best projects are always ones where there's been excellent collaboration. Thank you for that, Alice. Mark, you know, it's been a great couple of days for us. But what do you think is special about smaller cities, and how willing are they to embrace the value of nature in their work, as we saw yesterday with Glasgow and Utrecht?
Well, I have found that in many ways, the small cities are changing faster than the big ones, because, you know, big cities are generally cosmopolitan, they're politically connected globally, et cetera. And the smaller cities, though sometimes more insular, have been accepting a lot of new residents, a lot of in-migration to most North American smaller cities. And the idea of social diversity is very real in those places. And I learned this many, many years ago, but it's often the minority communities that find the idea of nature in the city most intriguing. They're often the quickest to embrace that as an idea. And I have, I call it agency, that the small cities have a sense of self, but they also have a sense of pressure because of those growth pressures. And they're looking for ways to revitalize older parts of their city. They're looking for ways to take advantage and put that diversity to work. They're looking for ways to maintain economic health. And it's becoming more and more clear, and the pandemic makes this obvious, that people want to live near nature. People want to live somewhere where they can be outdoors and go for a walk. We're all cooped up in little apartments these days, and being outside is such a powerful antidote to what we have to live with right now. I really, other than the costs of these projects, I rarely get any conceptual pushback.
Thanks, Mark. We've got some really good questions coming up here in the chat box. There's a question here: great ideas, but how do you plan to make the developments environmentally sustainable in terms of ecological communities that exist in the area? Perhaps, Gullivar, you might like to take that one.
How to make developers ecologically responsible?
How to make the developments environmentally sustainable, yeah.
Well, it's really, each project is a different struggle with that. Like comparing Brooklyn, where we had a lot of controls, where we wrote essentially the building controls for those developments, gave us quite a bit of leverage. And since the park was already partly there, they really couldn't cross the line and not do things that were spelled out, because they'd have the whole community up in arms. I'm also doing a lot of work in Texas. That is the Wild West for development, literally. And so we're doing a project that's a 1.5 mile transect through downtown, and it is just the hardest thing to communicate, because you know, you didn't have someone like Amanda Burden in the city of New York. You don't have an economic development. Sorry, this is specifically about Austin, Texas. You don't have an economic development corporation. You don't have ways to, like, devices to help conjoin development and public projects together in a more coherent way. And I'm struggling literally every day with, like, how to align projects that are on steep slopes inches apart from one another. So I think the answer is very locally determined. I hate to say that. And the point is you have to keep fighting for it, and there's no other way. And I think there's always, because so much of our work is involved with conservancies, doing joint development with cities, that the conservancy has this ability to be applying more pressure in some ways than the city, municipalities.
Thanks, Gulliver. Here's another good question from Henry Crabb. He has a question about forecasted urban exodus, potential ruralization. How might such a ruralization be embraced to support nature and community, and how might rural villages and locals specifically be retrofitted, redesigned to accommodate people and community whilst fostering biodiversity? I don't know who would like to take that question, perhaps Mark?
Well, I think if you go back to my little story of Boston, I look for that story no matter where we are. I just have it's imperative to me to understand why any city is where it is, what that history has been, and how it sits in today's world, economy and technologies, et cetera. And it's always possible to find those threads of former ecosystems and to find ways to unearth them. You know, here in Denver at the Stapleton Airport, it was an international airport of 4,500 acres, but we created 1,400 acres of open space, of which more than 800 roughly is prairie and riparian restoration. And that was done by organizing the stormwater within the new development, but also unearthing a couple of streams that had been in pipes under the runways for years. So I think there's always a way to do it.
Thanks, Mark. Just looking at some of these other questions. Gosh, there's a lot of them here, so I'm just trying to get through them to get a good spread. For Alice, here's a question for you from David Hawes. We can perhaps forgive historical projects for their single perspective, and reimagining these for multi-purpose is an undertaking, but how can we avoid yet to build new infrastructure from suffering from the same pitfalls? Roads and rail in the UK at least seem to be missed opportunities for greater integration of economic, social, and environmental. So how do we avoid falling into the same pitfalls that we have in the past?
I believe that it is fortunately Sisyphusian. Our urban infrastructure is never going to be paused in time and static, right? Even the Erie Canal, yes, it had one mandate, but it evolved over time, given the changes in technology, the changes in trade. So, you know, it is a boon to our industry that things will always transform. But in terms of, and I just related to kind of the, you know, that approach towards infrastructure, I love the idea of the circular economy, right? This is something very common in Europe. It's just kind of breaking on, you know, our side of the Atlantic. And it's usually applied to consumer goods. But how can we actually think about a circular economy of our urban infrastructure, where it is alive, it evolves? I love this, the Robert Moses BQE portion right next to Brooklyn Bridge Park. You know, in thinking about how it, you know, it's literally falling down, but how can we adapt it not just for the current types of cars, but for new mobility into the future? You know, this is the great thing about industry. We get to think big and long term. One other thing, when I was involved in the Rebuild by Design initiative, which was after Hurricane Sandy in New York, Henk Ovink, international water ambassador from the Netherlands, came up, and he would always talk about the idea of the Trojan horse. So, immediately after Hurricane Sandy, we needed to build protections, right? You needed to build barriers, you needed to prevent surge flood. But how do we actually use that investment in infrastructure as a Trojan horse to provide other benefits? Can that berm be a park? Can that berm have utilities laid within it? We're in a moment where there are so many interdisciplinary challenges that we're facing as a result of climate change, affordability, equity in our cities. Every opportunity that we have to create new infrastructure is an opportunity to provide a slew of different new transformations to our cities.
Oh, that's really good thinking, Alice. Thank you. And for Billy, question for you. Do we need to become more political to drive through the new Green Deal thinking?
Sure. I mean, I think that's the obvious answer. I think how that gets operationalized is much harder and looks different depending on where you are. For me, like, one of the luxuries of being in academia is that I don't have to respond to market forces, right? Like, and often choose not to. And I think, because we have the ability to do work like that in the academy, we also have an obligation to do at least some of it. Because a lot of the kind of work we've been able to do in the center is impossible, like in private practice. Is part of what drew me to this job. And part of what I think helps build a different kind of framework for practice that's longer term future than what we can build, let's say, tomorrow or in even a couple of years. How that gets operationalized in practice also looks a little bit different, right? Lots of firms spend lots of time putting people to work on competitions, on other kinds of work that is never guaranteed to pay out and often doesn't pay out at very high hit rates. Those are the kinds of resources and time that could be spent building trust and relationships with communities that are often cut out of the kinds of projects that we often work on in landscape architectural and design offices. And so for me, there's a spectrum of ways to do this depending on where you're positioned. In the academy, there's really no excuse for not taking some of these harder political questions on now. In practice, there's a tighter line to walk that everyone will have to kind of figure out for themselves. But it's the number one thing every student who comes through our program, the 50 some odd schools of architecture and design that I visited over the last year talking about Green New Deal stuff, it's the number one thing they're all asking for. And if we don't spend some time figuring out how to do this better as a set of professions, we're going to wind up losing a bunch of those really young, energetic people to other fields that feel provide more of a possibility for engaging in that kind of political and landscape work together.
Thanks, Billy. And I think drawing the questions and answers to an end, I would like to ask you all a question. I would like you to give me a very brief answer, but hopefully it's going to be a positive one. Do you think the climate for the environment is the climate for the environment in the USA today is more positive than it was on the 2nd of November? Billy, perhaps you'd like to go first.
Could you say that one more time for me? You cut out on my end a little bit.
Do you think the climate for the environment in the USA today is any more positive than it was on November the 2nd?
Yeah, of course, it couldn't be any worse. It was a complete shit show here, right, for the last 4 years. So, even the very modest, and we should be clear-eyed and honest about it. The very modest climate ambitions that the Biden administration will bring are light years ahead of where the Trump administration has taken us.
I love your honesty there, Billy. I think I agree with you, though. Gulliver, what about you?
Yes, no, our profession is all about optimism, but to Billy's point, yes, very cautiously optimistic. I was in one of a private chat with someone I was just mentioning. I mentioned at the very end of my last answer the role of conservancies and sort of the joint public-private processes in this. I really think has helped elevate a lot of the discussion at a local level politically about the importance of these things. And I'm just going to repeat that. I think that's something to watch, the whole Highline network and what it's doing. I think pushing at all levels. Yes, it's the new Green Deal is a fantastic constellation of ideas to keep accentuating, but I think this very local side of it is really exciting as well. and how to connect all this and bundle it together could make real change.
Thank you, Gulliver. And Alice?
I mean, I remember the moment when we dropped out of the Paris Accord. I was talking to the mayor of Nashville about urban tree canopy, and to have that undergirding this conversation about sustainability was just dramatically sad. But so that in and of itself will be important. I know our team does a lot of sustainability, climate change mitigation planning, and once there's a mandate to participate in the global standards, you know, that is invaluable. I'll also say it's not just a battle on kind of, you know, national, global environmental policy, but also a battle against cities. Trump is from New York City, and he has again and again undermined, you know, affordability, building of infrastructure. We have congestion pricing looming that's been approved by the city, been approved by the state, and it's being held up at the federal level. That is incredibly important to, you know, update our mobility systems. So I think a national reinvestment in cities, parallel to what we had during the New Deal and WPA, would be fantastic.
Thanks, Alice. And finally, Mark, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I've already volunteered my services to go to the White House to help pack the truck, and I can't wait for the callback. But I actually think that we need to make a distinction. Obviously, Green New Deal, very important. Messages and policy coming out of Washington, extremely important. But, and obviously there will be a big shift, and it's about time. But I find that if I refer to an ecological imperative and a climate imperative, those topics fall, they are welcome to most ears wherever I go. And, you know, the everyday person in the everyday city pretty much gets it and has a concern. Of course, the pandemic has accelerated that concern, but it's the leadership from the top is very important. But I think at the grassroots, on the ground level, there's an awful lot we can do. And of course, we're going to make this change happen incrementally, not by fiat.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I would just like to say, to sum up really our session today, before I sort of hand back to Brian to finish off, what the sort of key takeaways have been from this. I think you've all provided such inspiring examples of work for us to aspire to. And it's wonderful to see that Ian McHarg still influences our work. He's inspiring the next generation, and it's more relevant today than it's ever been. I think we've also looked at the importance of collaboration to achieve the best possible outcomes, because some of the projects we've seen today have been very complex, and no one single professional can actually deliver those on their own, and it requires a great team with talent and foresight to be able to deliver those. And I think it's important that landscape architects were a creative profession, and it's important that we celebrate this. And I think together around the world we can make a huge difference, and we need to get political about it. So I'd like to thank all the speakers this afternoon for their amazing and wonderful contributions, and I've really enjoyed listening to all of you. Thank you very much. And just before we finish, I just would like to share my screen. There's a few events coming up that you might be interested in. Just moving on, before I hand over to Brian, on the 26th of November, excuse me, we have the Landscape Institute Awards here in the UK. It's free to attend because it's our first one ever online, and it will be hosted by Julia Bradbury, and it will feature some of the best work that the UK landscape architects will be showcasing. And the LI has launched an ideas competition, which the closing date is the 4th of December, so you've still got an opportunity to participate. It's transforming the urban landscape, and they're both student and professional categories, so I'd encourage you all to take a look at that. It's on the Landscape Institute's website. And finally, the AOU is also running a series of events aiming to celebrate and learn from some of the past finalists of the Urbanism Awards. And coming up this Friday and the following Friday are the Learning from the Great Streets, which is Friday the 13th, and Learning from the Great Places, which is Friday the 20th. And all these details can be found on the AOU website. So it leaves me only to say a big thank you to all of you, and for Tony for a most interesting and thought-provoking session. And I'd like to hand back now to Brian. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Jane. Just before I do a wrap-up of thanks to everyone, I said yesterday at the start that for many of us, of course, Ian McHarg was the public intellectual. His work has influenced our work, it's influenced our careers. But of course, Ian was also the private man, beloved husband, father, uncle. And we've been so pleased that some of Ian's family have joined us. So just before I wrap up the day, could I ask Carol, Ian's widow, to say a few words to us all? Carol, are you there? Can you switch on your mic and your video if you've got one, and give us a message, please?
Now, no?
Yeah, we can see you.
We
can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay,
yeah.
Great.
Hi.
Well, hi. Nice to meet you, Brian. What a wonderful event. I'd like to sort of bring it back to Ian, the man, and I'll do so by telling you some things that probably most of you don't know about him. I sat down and tried to brainstorm what might be of interest to a group such as this. Actually, I decided we really need to get together with a couple cases of wine and a lot of time and just share stories. I think it would be the best way to go about it. But failing that, I've made a list and I will try to entertain you with it. The first thing I'd like to say about Ian was he was a good man. And he asked me, or he told me several times, that he really wanted to be remembered as a good man. Not a great man, but a good man. And I think those of us who know him can agree that Ian McHarg was a good man. He saw the best in others. He had an ability to find something of interest in people and draw them out and make people feel better than they were, which is of course why he was such a great teacher. Shortly after he died, my sons and I were going someplace. We had to go to the airport and we took a limo, Delaware limo, and the limo driver said, asked us where Ian was, and we of course told him that he had died, and he pulled over to the side of the road and started to cry. And it was the most moving event. He told us that he and Ian used to sing jazz on their way to and from the airport every time. And he loved picking up Ian because they had this in common, which is just a good example of Ian's ability to pull out the best in everybody. So that also brings me to the first of one of the things you may not have known about Ian, and that is that he loved jazz. And beginning as a young child in Scotland, he used to get the American jazz records and with friends try to decipher what the meaning was of these strange words. Some of them are quite funny. The next thing that you may not know is that when I met Ian, he had one pair of shoes. And in fact, he had one pair of shoes for probably 50 years of his life. They were very high quality cordovan shoes, which got shod and reshod and reshod. But it took us years to get him a pair of sneakers. He just felt that one pair of shoes was more than anybody needed and that they would do for everything. He did eventually, before he died, got a pair of sandals. He also made gigantic breakfasts on the weekends. He said they were Scottish. I'm not sure. Maybe you could verify this. They included bacon, eggs, sausage, scrapple, toast and marmalade, grapefruit with honey. What else? Surely there was more. But every weekend, that was the breakfast on tap. You may not know that Ian was a pig farmer. We at one time had 100 pigs, and Ian was often late for his classes because our pigs had escaped, and he had to chase them and put them in before he could leave for school. And in fact, there was a newspaper article once which described this to the readers. We also had a Scottish Highland cow and bull. And the bull was named Fergus. It was Fiona and Fergus escaped often. He had those long horns and terrorized the neighborhood. Ian would chase the bull and bring it back home using our Volkswagen Beetle. Let's see, what else might you not know? He loved working with cement. He was constantly working in the garden. He laid miles of paving. He loved to garden. He was in the 70s named one of Philadelphia's 10 most sexiest men. Let's see. He was asked to do a coffee commercial using his Scottish accent, and also a TV show using his Scottish accent. Thank God he declined, although I think there was good money in it. Okay, and as I said, we could go on and on. I could tell you all sorts of things you don't know, but I think to bring it back to Design with Nature, I believe you'll enjoy this letter dated October 22nd, 1968, from F111 Leverett House, Cambridge, Mass. You've done a superb job, dear Ian. The manuscript came at the last possible moment for me to read it. For tomorrow, I resume work on volume 2 of The Myth. So I spent part of my 73rd birthday writing the introduction, from which you may delete anything you find false, distasteful, or superfluous. I am sending back the manuscript under separate cover. Good luck to you and the book. Warmly, Lewis. That, is Lewis Mumford, his handwritten note. So thank you. What a great, great event. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for coming. What a lovely note from Lewis Mumford. My goodness me, that's just amazing. Yeah. Carol, thank you. And thank you also to all the members of the family who have been on the call. Malcolm, I've seen, Martin and Karine, and I don't know if you've, I know we asked some others too, but it's just been wonderful. Well, look, Jane and Tony, I don't think I can top that really, but I'm not gonna run through a great long list of names, but really we do need to say some thank yous. And I don't think I will read everyone's name out, but could I just say to the panel today, the modesty and talent of you all was inspirational. I really thought it was just fantastic. We had wonderful contributions yesterday as well. And without picking anybody out particularly, I do have to make a special mention for our friends from the University of Pennsylvania and also Laurel from Morgan State. But above all, I really got to say thank you to Bill Whitaker, who broke Zoom yesterday, really. And it was just amazing with Bill's special introduction to the archives yesterday, and to Carol for her warm words about her late husband at the end. After all, we're all here today because it is Ian's centenary in a few days' time. So it's kind of special, and it's rather special for me, since Design with Nature was the primus inter pares of the books that changed my life, and what I did, and went from being an environmental scientist to realizing I had to train in design if I was going to make a difference. And yeah, so it was fantastic. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Tony. Thanks to all the staff of the Academy for all their work in bringing this all together. Of course, thanks to all of you for coming and making it happen. Thank you again to the family. We've recorded this. It'll be on the Academy's YouTube channel, and we're going to try and use some tricky Glasgow School of Art software to produce a transcript of everything that's been said. So we might be back to our contributors to ask for an illustration or two to try and produce a little publication in Ian's name, looking forward from his centenary towards COP next year. Thanks also to Mark, who towards the end of his remarks said something about Ian which struck home to me, actually, which boiled down to what my professor of architectural history had said, that the challenge for us as designers is to reconcile the genius loci, the spirit of the place, with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. That's the job. McHarg knew that. He spelled it out. It was the job then, and it's the job today. Rachel, are we leaving the call open for people to mingle if they want? But that, I think, unless I've been dilatory in my duty in handing back to Jane or Tony, I believe concludes the formal part of the proceedings. And thank you all so much. Make a noise, shake your hands, wave something about, wave something about. Yeah, brilliant, great, great group of people. Thank you so much for making it happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.